Welcome to How to Write an Argument Paper, a Writing 1 presentation. Please follow along with this presentation by looking in Chapter 3 in How to Write Anything. As you start this slide, make sure that you look at the slide to see what pages we're working on here, where we're starting. As you get started on your argument type of paper, whether it's clearly identified as an argument or in later classes it's just going to be expected that you're writing what's called basically an argument paper. They'll call it lots of different things, but this is basically the approach you will take. And we want to get started on this similar to how we would start some other papers, and that is with research. And it makes sense, common sense really, that you're going to learn more before you decide what and how to argue about it. You want to make sure that you're looking at good sources, of course. We've talked about this in other slides and other presentations throughout this course, but credible quality research is super important for an argument because you want your audience to follow along with you. You want them to believe you, and you want to be able to persuade them if needed. And you're going to use credible quality sources to persuade them instead of, kind of shoddy sources or sources that really don't help you. Then as you start thinking about, okay, here's my topic, I'm finding more information, I think this is kind of where I want to go, that's where you're going to make a preliminary claim. That's just basically mapping it out and saying, okay, I think this is what I'm trying to prove with this paper. As you develop that claim, then you're going to do what's called qualify it, and that's making it a little bit more reasonable, as the book says. That's basically looking at your claim and asking yourself, okay, now how can I make this not so extreme? I believe what I believe, and I want to make this argument, but I need to think about how there might be exceptions or how other people might look at it and disagree, and how I can maybe convince them to be on my side if I make some exceptions here, make it qualified a little bit. So as we know, a thesis is always a work in progress as you're starting on your paper, and they add some words here about how you can qualify your claim. So instead of saying everything is absolute and this claim is true, period, you want to add some of these words like some or most or a few or under certain conditions. We are saying, okay, this is generally true, but here's where maybe there's an exception on this. Or, when necessary, this needs to happen. And again, this is where you're going to help readers see that you are a reasonable person. You don't see the world in only black and white. And it's really going to help your credibility factor. And then once you start getting some ideas, you're going to go back and do more research to find more evidence to support your claim, and then start thinking about other points of view as well. We're going to spend a lot more time talking about assumptions here. I'm putting this in the PowerPoint here for you so we remember to go back and consider our assumptions, and also called premises. Again, we're going to go through a whole critical thinking presentation about this, so I'm not going to get super in depth. But what this means is think about the underlying beliefs and ideas that you hold. That maybe you don't even put words to those, but you still have those sort of as an underlying basis for everything that you think. And we'll look at some examples here in the book. You can see there. I've marked out where that information is. Look at those so you have a general sense of this right now, and then go back through the critical thinking presentation, and this will make a lot more sense. A really important point to consider as you are getting started on your paper is to understand your audience. And again, we're hitting on some same themes from other papers, but focusing it more closely on argument here. You want to consider who is going to be reading this, who you are trying to convince, and what you know about that audience, because that will really help you plan ahead. So for example, we're going to talk about credibility or ethos. And again, we've talked about this already, but just as a reminder from rhetoric, it's how you know how you appeal to an audience as far as your own credibility, as far as your own tone, what your personality is. You want people to trust you. You want people to also like you to some extent. And you want people to trust your voice throughout a paper. So that's going to get into things about not being obnoxious in your tone. You want to be reasonable in your tone. And you want to use, again, credible sources so people believe you. You also want to think, especially in the research process, what your own limits are. And when you think about your own limits, We're talking about what you've been exposed to or what you've allowed yourself to be exposed to up until that point. And many of us, whether we're 18 or 38 or 58 or 78, many of us are unwilling to recognize that there are perfectly legitimate opinions outside of our own. And we're also often unaware about all the different sources that might be out there we're not used to using. And we need to start expanding some of those things. And I'm not talking about changing all your ideas because you got more educated. Sometimes that happens. But more often, you're understanding how to work with those other things that are out there, and you're learning to become a more reasonable person with them, and you're learning how to take those things and address them in your own paper. We'll spend more time with that in another presentation. But you want to think about how maybe your own circle of friends or circle of people that you get most of your information from is pretty limited. And that's what we're talking about here, is moving and pushing past that. And you want to be respectful of other people who do not have the same views, or when we talk about premises, the same premises as your own. And you got to think about where people are coming from. Here it talks about consider the worlds of your readers in the book. You want to think about where people are coming from because their experiences might be different from your experiences. And most of us, our opinions, our beliefs are actually shaped as much or more by experience than they are by cold, hard fact. Most of what you believe has a lot to do with your experience. Now, that's not always the case. I and my sister grew up with somewhat similar experiences. We grew up in the same family, but we have vastly differing points of view. In our adult lives, we have had very different experiences that have led to even more of a different point of view. So you want to think about those things and be respectful of other people based on that. When you go to actually start developing your claim, then here are some handy steps. And again, there are some page numbers on the slide that you can look at. Now, what you're doing is you're working a little bit with logic here, and there's a good process that you can go on and a good way to break this down. We'll look at a graphic on that here in just a minute. But you're going to have your claim, of course, which we've talked about. Your claim will be supported by reasons. So when you think about what your claim is and where you want to go with your paper, you want to look at that claim and say, why? And you might say, I think that we need to outlaw pepperoni pizza or something ridiculous like that. You know, you'll want a more serious paper, but I want to outlaw pepperoni pizza. Here are my reasons. Number one, pepperonis taste awful. Number two, pepperoni is greasy. Number three, pepperoni looks horrible. All of this leads me to say we need to ban pepperoni pizza. No pepperonis on pizza. So you've come up with your claim. You've come up with your list of reasons there. And then your reasons are going to be supported by evidence, which is where, again, research comes into play. So if your reasons for supporting pepperoni pizza are that they're greasy, that they look bad, etc., you're going to go find research that backs that up. You will also find research that shares an opposing view and share that as well. Again, we'll get into that in another presentation. But largely now you're ready to do some research and find the evidence to support your reasons why, and be open to the fact that you might find even more reasons why, or you might be convinced by your research that maybe your reasons are pretty lousy, or even completely change your mind while you're researching. That's the beauty of research and learning. But your job right now is to come up with some reasons to support your claim and then go find some research evidence. Here's a little graphic I made to help illustrate what we were just talking about. You're starting off with your claim, and then you're coming up with reasons why you believe that claim, and then you're coming up with evidence to back up those reasons and to support those reasons. So those all work together. And don't forget about over on the left your assumptions, which again, we'll look at those in the critical thinking presentation. But your assumptions are going to lead into your claim as well. And your assumptions are going to help you better understand your reasons. Because when you think about, well, I'm assuming that these reasons back up this claim because of blah, 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 again, sometimes you need to rethink those assumptions or understand that your audience, which we just spent a bunch of time talking about, may not have those same assumptions. Let's talk about emotional appeals with argument. And you see a picture in here, and I don't know if you can see it very well, but it's a bunch of dogs in a cage, and I happened to take the picture when my cat was on top of it, and I thought it was really hilarious, and I know it's weird, but enjoy it. The reason that I have this, though, here is that it's to remind us many times when we think of emotional appeals, we think about those sad commercials on television, right? You're enjoying your favorite show, you're laughing your head off, you're relaxing, you're forgetting for half an hour or an hour or two or whatever. You're forgetting about your homework and all your cares, or maybe you're doing your homework during it. Like I do a lot of grading while I watch TV, and that's okay. Whatever the case, you're watching television, and suddenly there it is, right? The sad music and the pictures of the animals staring out from behind the bars of a cage, and oh, look at those poor puppies, and oh my goodness, I better donate some money. And I would have found a way to use that in this presentation, but we have copyright to think about. So I just use my own picture as well. What this represents, though, is this idea of that emotional appeal. I mean, I'm not going to lie. Those sad commercials with the animals, they hit me. Okay, I have dogs, and so that is a soft spot for me, but that's a soft spot for a lot of people. And the people who make those commercials, they're legitimate organizations, and they know that those emotional appeals work, so they use them. So when we're talking about using an emotional appeal for an argument, we need to think about the range of emotions that you could evoke. Yes, you could evoke sadness and empathy, and there's that word empathy that reminds us of pathos, right? And we could evoke anger, right? Or fear, lots of things that we can do. But we need to be responsible. So it's okay to use some emotional appeal. I mean, we talked about that as a rhetorical device, and it's a legitimate thing to do. But we want to be responsible because we want our readers to keep considering us credible. And we'll talk later about mistakes people make and kind of cheap tricks that they use in arguments. And one of them is to overly use those emotional appeals. And people sometimes feel like, man, I'm being manipulated. Or maybe they get cold-hearted to it. So it could backfire sometimes, and it could result in people not seeing you as credible because they think, well, they might not have a very good set of evidence. They might not have really good reasons. Their logic must be faulty because they're mostly relying on cheap emotional appeals rather than actually building a solid argument. So while you should use some emotional appeals, you need to be careful. Often when we think about argument, we do think about those emotional appeals, or we think about someone who just is really great at rhetoric, as we call it, somebody who's just an amazing speaker. But really, argument, a lot of it comes down to structure. So we need to think about how we plan our structure. And sometimes, like we talked about, you need to come out with your thesis fairly early on and then support it, and people know your argument from very early on, and you're supporting it, and you're helping them come to this place that you've already told them you want them to go. Other times, you need to just build toward your point. Really, those are those are up to you. Those are your choice. Now, traditional structure is fine, which again, that would be have your introduction for a paragraph, 2, 3, whatever. We've seen some examples in our class where some introductions are longer than others. And many people would say, okay, then you put your thesis statement, your claim, your argument right there at the end of your introduction and go from there. And that's a fine way to go about it. And many of you will do that, and it'll work just fine. But keep in mind that maybe you need to change your structure. So consider that. Oftentimes, at the beginning, you need to spell out what's at stake. And you can do that no matter what structure you're choosing. That's often a good thing, is that you're telling people what's at stake. In other words, what could happen, or why this matters, or why this issue is important. Again, you can make a point early or build toward one. That's your choice. You also want to address counterpoints when necessary, not in a separate section. And sometimes, especially students who are fairly new to this type of writing, they'll wait until toward the end and then try to put all their counterpoints, all their opposing arguments into one little paragraph toward the end. And I don't know if they're hoping that by saving it then they've already won everybody over, and so they're just adding those in the end just to make sure that they cover everything, but people should already be with them without thinking about that. But that doesn't really work. You need to bring up the counterpoints within the points as you're making them. So oftentimes when you look at this structurally, when you're making a point, address the opposition to that right where you're making that point. So as you provide your reasons and your evidence, well, if there's some evidence that contradicts that, or if there's an opposing argument, address it right then. Put that right in that section, don't wait. And of course, it's a pretty well-known device for rhetoric that you hold your best arguments for the end. And that's something that often works. Now, some people would argue, see, get what I did there. Some people would argue, no, you need to have your really good arguments early on, because that way you can win people over. But a lot of times, saving your best argument for last, that's what will leave the lasting impression in readers' minds, and really that's what you want to do. It's really about how you finish. So that's a pretty good suggestion there. Using an appropriate style is also very important for an argument. As we've talked about a number of times, your ethos, your credibility is very important. And so, as we talked about, you need to plan ahead and think about what kind of audience might be reading this, and stay reasonable for that audience. Be sensitive to their readers' views. You don't want to use hyperbole and attack language. Hyperbole is when you're exaggerating, you're using a lot of really strong language, and we don't necessarily even mean curse words or dirty language there. We just mean very strong, argumentative language that kind of goes over the top. Or using attack language, which is calling people names or using a lot of military terms. We want to avoid that for the most part, because we don't want people to be kind of rolled over. We don't want people to push back out of defensiveness because we're coming on so strong. They might even agree with us, but we come on so strong that they just push back, because that's what people often do. So your opening or introduction is very important, and you need a strong opening because you got to get people interested and you got to get people following along. And we've talked already about using good introductions and some of those techniques. So pull out your best techniques here. Pull out your best stuff. Use a good opening. Again, there are different ways that you can do that. We've talked about the introductions before, and you can look in your book more about introductions. But keep in mind that if you can't get people to follow you with your introduction, then they're not going to make it through the rest of the paper to see how you back up your argument. So you got to make it good. You also need to use lots of description and vibrant sentences. And one of the common weaknesses in writers, usually in English Comp 1 and then even into Comp 2, one of the biggest gaps that I see consistently over the years is that we don't like to include details. We like to talk in broad generalities. And so you'll see oftentimes in your papers and on your drafts, I'll put more details, please. Be specific. And that's really important here with your argument. Because if you give people what we call concrete details, in other words, details that they can see and touch and feel and hear and even smell, those things are going to make it real for people. And when you make it real for people, then they will follow you a little bit better. They'll understand better. They'll be more likely to follow along. You can also use these rhetorical questions, and most of us are familiar with those. That's when we use questions and we frame them in such a way that we try to get people to go a certain direction with them. And you can see some examples there on the bottom of page 93. I hope you are following along. Maybe you want to pause and look and read through that. But that's an example of somebody who, again, framing the questions. Now, we do need to be kind of careful with framing questions. Some of us who don't have as much experience will just randomly ask questions because we think, well, yeah, you're supposed to ask questions. Well, but sometimes you ask questions and you give people a chance to respond to things in their own way, and you've lost them. So use rhetorical questions very carefully, but when you use them right, again, that can be really helpful. If you have questions about that or any of this stuff, of course, talk to me, get my feedback on this. And then think about images and design. And that's not really something that we think about too much with these papers for this class, but as you present materials in other classes, as you start doing other projects, think about images that you can use that tell a story. Again, the old cliche is a picture is worth 1,000 words. And think about that. You know, that doesn't mean you're replacing 1,000 words of your paper with a picture, obviously, but that can really help go a long way improving your argument. Again, design, they talk some in the book about that as well, something to think about. Now that you've viewed this presentation, please make sure that you view the other presentations in this unit. We do have quizzes and other things to go through. I recommend reading as many of the models and examples as you can in this chapter as well. That will give you some background. Some of those we'll use specifically for activities. Sometimes we won't. But please look through those, and those will really help as well. Please also make sure that as you work on your paper, you go back and you look through these presentations to help you remember some key ideas.